BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Today we're revisiting the case of Gypsy Rose Blanchard and the murder of her mother, Dee Dee Blanchard. On this channel back in 2019, we did several uploads talking about Gypsy Rose and the circumstances that led to the murder of her mother. But that was prior to a lot of the discussions that we had about true crime and psychology and just how do these things play out. And it's not always the psychology of the situation. It's like the social factors as well that lead people to be involved in these types of criminal behaviors. When we're looking at this case, we always have to bring in a third individual. We have Gypsy Rose Blanchard, her mother Dee Dee, and Gypsy Rose Blanchard's ex-boyfriend, Nick Godejohn. And if you ever get a chance to watch that show, The Act, that was put out by Hulu, their version of Nick Godejohn is someone who is rather sympathetic, and he's almost somewhat of a likable character who is misunderstood. And I never really had that feeling about him watching the documentaries and some of the other true crime videos out there, and even just listening to Dr. Phil and his stuff. I always thought that Nick Godejohn was something quite to the contrary, that he was a person who was not very likable, and he was someone who was a little bit sleazier, for lack of a better term. But the reason why we started talking about more television series and web shows and movies on this channel is because it's one of the major ways that the general public gets access to these types of stories. And I highly recommend everybody watch The Act. You know, Patricia Arquette just won the Golden Globe. I was hoping that Joey King, who plays Gypsy Rose Blanchard, would have won the Globe. You know, just that was the only show that I had seen out of the nominated actresses in the category. But anyway, I digress from that. The big thing is, though, we want to look at why this thing happened. And with somebody like Nick Godejohn, I was checking out Dr. Todd Grande's channel. I watch his channel from time to time. I just think he talks in an engaging way. You can binge watch his videos very easily. And some of the points that he brought up about Nick Godejohn were that Nick Godejohn only had an IQ of 82. He, of course, had autism spectrum disorder. That's very much factored into things. They discussed that a lot at the trial. But the video that I was watching was entitled, "Did Gypsy Rose Blanchard Manipulate Nick Godejohn?" And it's about 20 minutes long, but I can answer that question in one sentence. Did Gypsy Rose Blanchard manipulate Nick Godejohn? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely she did. It's just that manipulation happens in a lot of different ways. We've talked about some true crime cases where someone is pretty much telling his girlfriend, if you leave, I will kill you right now. That's one type of manipulation, but there's also the more thing about pulling somebody into their web, getting somebody under their spell. And it doesn't necessarily mean that Nick Godejohn is an absolute saint. He was not. This is the guy that got arrested for watching porn in McDonald's for 9 hours and masturbating. And one of the things that I did not know about him that Dr. Todd Grande provided was he was also charged with possession of a deadly weapon, a concealed deadly weapon, and it was just a knife, but he had a concealed knife on him that also brought about another charge, but that did not result in a conviction. So the thing is, though, what did we say last year that is now applicable to Gypsy Rose Blanchard? And it really relates to a lot of the discussions we had about the cycle of destructive behaviors. Gypsy Rose Blanchard was abused. All parties agree with that. She was the victim of abuse. She then turned and started abusing Nick Godejohn. Why? Because some people internalize the abusive behavior within themselves. They import it within them, like the addicts, the alcoholics, promiscuous and risky behavior. They internalize it and they bring it into themselves. Other people export it outward. They externalize it and they put their abuse onto somebody else. They're just exporting their unhealed trauma onto another person. And that really seems like Gypsy Rose Blanchard and Nick Godejohn. Absolutely. Because another thing that isn't very controversial is Gypsy Rose Blanchard was the dominant member of that relationship. And it's like, it really just feels like Nick Godejohn was groomed for this. And that's what I want to say when it's like relationships that become manipulative are not always done through brute force. It can be done through the process of grooming and somewhat of a very subtle and very gradual change, because they were talking for years before they met. and before they planned the murder of Dee Dee Blanchard. And some people are on the more extreme end of the speculation spectrum. Speculation spectrum, that's a good thing. We should coin that term. Some people are on the far end of the speculation spectrum are just like Gypsy Rose Blanchard must have planned this from the beginning. She knew that she was going to murder her mother from the beginning. She just needed the right guy. Now, that's more of an extreme statement. Another statement is just like Gypsy Rose was the victim of extreme abuse. Her mother was forcing her to live in this very painful and very debilitating way for profit and for attention, for sympathy, all of those things. When I was watching that Dr. Todd Grande video, he was talking about how Munchausen by proxy syndrome, I mean, like using the other name for it as well, is something where Dee Dee Blanchard really wanted sympathy from other people. And I was like, well, yeah, that's true, but also for money, for profit. I mean, even the house they were living in was provided to them by a foundation. Gypsy Rose Blanchard was the cash cow for Dee Dee Blanchard, and Gypsy Rose became very much aware of that. And one of the reasons why a lot of people believe that she retaliated in the way she did is she just became aware of all of the evils that had been placed upon her, just how her mother was exploiting her. And when we look at Dee Dee Blanchard as a person, they really tried to show this in the act that she was the victim of emotional abuse. And the reason why I say show you is because they give you more of a step-by-step sequencing of how the abuse would have been placed upon Dee Dee Blanchard. So Dee Dee Blanchard's mother is emotionally abusing her. She then turns to physically abusing Gypsy Rose Blanchard, and then Gypsy Rose Blanchard exports her abuse out onto Nick Godejohn, and it's like these like unhealed traumas. It's like the abusive characteristics of somebody's personality just keep going on and on and on, and that's why we call it the cycle of destructive behaviors. And in the past, I used to think that perhaps the actions of Nick Godejohn were something that could break the cycle of destructive behaviors, but a big question that I was just wondering about now is, will Gypsy Rose Blanchard go back to prison in the future? She was only sentenced to 10 years in prison. Will she go back to prison in the future? Will she be involved with another destructive case? Part of me is like, well, I really hope not. Do I believe in the process of rehabilitation? Yes, someone can be rehabilitated. Absolutely, they can. But will Gypsy Rose? Only time will tell, but it's not really looking good for her now, because another thing that we've noticed with people who experience the cycle of destructive behaviors is that they tend to, it's that whole concept of how you find them is how they are. They don't necessarily tend to get better once they're free from it. Once they're free from the destruction, they often tend to start just bringing the destruction either onto somebody else or continuing it within themselves. And in the case of Gypsy Rose Blanchard, she would be continuing the destructive behavior by exporting it outward, externalizing it, and finding someone else to abuse. I would really hope that that's not the case and that she will find some sort of remedy to the situation during her time in prison. But with Nick Godejohn, it's quite different because he was given life without the possibility of parole. And when I first heard about that, I was really thinking that that sentence was very excessive. I mean, if they're going to say all these things like he only has an IQ of 82 and he has autism spectrum disorder, why isn't that taken into account that he could be easily deceived? And the points that Dr. Todd Grande brought up in favor of that were very simple, that it was a premeditated murder. He had many opportunities to say no. He had many opportunities to leave. He had many opportunities to contact the authorities. And he chose not to every time. And one of the big reasons is because of lust, because he wanted to be in a regular sexual relationship with Gypsy Rose Blanchard. A big motivation for Nick Godejohn to commit the murder was lust, and not to mention he even contemplated sexually assaulting Dee Dee Blanchard, although he chose not to, but they factored that in as well. I was quite surprised that Dr. Todd Grande was saying that the life in prison was a good thing, but he didn't agree with the fact that he was not given the possibility of parole. But at the same time, I thought that the video that I was just discussing was actually making a convincing case that he shouldn't get the possibility of parole, because what they're saying is Nick Godejohn is a very dangerous person. I mean, someone who's actually going to be able to be put into that situation and is going to choose to murder somebody, once again, knowing fully well that he can walk away at any time, knowing fully well that he can leave, that he can contact somebody, he could have get out of the situation, and whatever you want to say, he would have had that ability to do so, then he is somewhat of a dangerous person, and if he is back out in society, this is also partnered with the fact that he was busted for indecent exposure, masturbating in a McDonald's, and carrying a knife, which was possession of a concealed, unregistered weapon, weapons charge, possession of a deadly weapon, whatever the exact phrasing would be. They're just like, it's highly likely that he could go on to commit another heinous crime. So that's one of the reasons why he was given life without the possibility of parole. But still, though, I mean, a lot of people really believe that his sentence was excessive because I just said at the beginning, I said it's very clear that he was manipulated into this. Was lust a factor into this? Yes. Did Gypsy Rose Blanchard manipulate him with lust? Yes. Is she the first woman to ever manipulate a guy by playing off of his lustful side? I don't think so. I'm almost certain that she is not. But at the same time, that's what happened. It's like, and it's a real tragedy. And with Gypsy Rose Blanchard, many other people are viewing her as someone who was very damaged. Her thought process was, somewhat fractured to the point where she's tried to leave her mother multiple times, and her mother found ways to get her back, and she did not know a way to escape. She did not know any other way to get out. And on the one hand, that seems like it could be very plausible, but at the same time, it's like she had so many opportunities to go about it in a non-destructive way. And what I've said about a lot of the other true crime cases out there is just that a lot of people commit these types of murders. They commit these types of crimes because they think they aren't going to get caught. They think that their plan is just so well constructed and so well orchestrated that they aren't going to get caught, that they're not going to be the one who is going to go to jail. They've done this in a way in which no one is going to find out that it was them. That happens countless times on all the forensic shows. It's just somebody thinks that they've outsmarted the police, that they aren't going to leave any evidence behind. And that level of arrogance is one of the things that leads to their downfall. Not to mention there are a million ways that things can go wrong. I mean, these days, if you just breathe in someone else's home, you're going to be leaving DNA behind, more or less. But at the same time, though, with this very specific case, I think one of the reasons why it attracts a lot of people is people just don't know what to feel. It's like they want to feel an enormous amount of sympathy for Gypsy Rose Blanchard, but at the same time they feel conflicted because she did orchestrate the murder of her mother. That was a difficult sentence to say. And the big thing about Nick Godejohn is they definitely view that he was deceived and he was manipulated. And did Gypsy Rose Blanchard ever care about him? Well, I would have to turn to the Rewired Soul for that, because that channel just flat out said, the relationship with Gypsy Rose Blanchard and Nick Godejohn is very simple. After the murder, and they get caught by the police, and they're going to be going to prison, she's just like, peace, and she wants nothing to do with him. Did she ever really care about Nick Godejohn? Yeah, it doesn't look like it. So is it possible that extreme thing of the speculation spectrum that we were talking about? That's big points for that side. I mean, that's definitely something that's encouraging us to look that way, that she wanted her mother gone, she wanted her mother murdered, and just he was the most likely candidate. It's just like searching around for somebody who could get her out of this, even if it meant murdering her mother. Who's the most likely individual to go along with that? But what's the heart of that issue? That's not just somebody who's being practical. No, that's the recreation of the cycle of destructive behaviors, externalizing it, exporting it, being the victim of abuse, and then finding someone else to project their abuse onto. Gypsy Rose is being forced to live like a prisoner in her own home, being forced to use the wheelchair, and being forced to live this life that isn't true. Now she's going to be forcing that upon Nick Godejohn, and then he is going to be forced to be the one who's going to be subject to her abuse, and then once that's over, peace, see ya, nice knowing ya, Nicholas, and then that's it. That's it. So we can really see, though, that this is just a pattern that we tend to notice with a lot of victims of abuse and a lot of victims in these criminal cases. It's just what seems to happen. The cycle of destructive behaviors and the cycle of the abuse does not end with freedom. It's not just like, well, now I no longer have to worry about that person who was abusing me. Everything is fine. I wish life were like that. I wish it was that easy. But it's just, it really is not that simple. And you would think that once people are away from their abuser, that they could just kind of grow into something much stronger, but that does not seem the case. It seems like abuse seems to perpetuate over and over again. Well, that's all for me now. What do you have to say about the case of Gypsy Rose Blanchard and the murder of her mother, Dee Dee Blanchard? The big question to ask is, do you believe that Nicholas Godejohn got a fair sentence, life without the possibility of parole, whereas Gypsy Rose Blanchard was only given 10 years in prison? And what do you think about those comments that we made about the cycle of destructive behaviors? That Gypsy Rose Blanchard was the victim of abuse, so in turn, she began to abuse Nick Godejohn. And the final question that I would like to ask would be, do you believe that Gypsy Rose Blanchard will be going to prison again in the future if and when she is released? I say if only because we don't really know what's going to happen, and that is years away. Do you believe that she is just going to be completely rehabilitated, or do you believe that maybe 2 or 3 years after being let out of prison that she'll be back in the slammer again for something else? I would love to hear what any of your comments below. That's all for me now. And if you like this upload, you can hit the like button. If you want to subscribe, you're welcome to do so. But most importantly, please drop some comments below, and until next time.